Egyptian markets, they are preparing themselves for big intraday moves. Circuit breakers, they say, if we see the market plunging by 10%, markets will stop trading.
Okay, so they went away for like 6 weeks, and everybody's been saying these Egyptians are totally useless. What's wrong with them? And to point, you've got to say that's fair, because in Japan, they had a crisis of epic proportions on the Friday afternoon, and they opened the markets on Monday. So if you were running around headless and you wanted to sell all of your Japanese shares, you're welcome to. And someone else was able to stand up and take them.
What is the best move to do? Should you open up markets when you are in crisis mode, or should you perhaps just leave it?
I think you ought to. But look, it's not as though the Egyptians are the first to do this. When 9/11 hit, the Americans, shut down the markets, I think, for a full calendar week. But the Egyptians have been pushing their luck a bit. I think after 6 weeks, you've got to start asking questions. I mean, they're winning football games around the world, and you haven't opened the stock exchange.
Trading is going to be reduced to 3 hours from 4 hours. What kind of losses are you expecting?
Oh, my goodness, I've got no idea. I mean, people will be looking at whether or not the investment perceptions of the country have changed. But I was kind of thinking that they were totally disgraceful, but then I saw that they'd had some kind of referendum over the weekend, which is going to lead to a new constitution, and that had gone off well. And as a result of that, the credit default swaps on Egyptian sovereign debt had come down quite sharply. So you've got to hand it perhaps to the government that what they wanted to do was kind of get back on even keel, and then investors could make a more rational decision.
Is that region a place that you want to be in right now? Because you've got Libya, you've got Egypt, you've got Tunisia.
I can't imagine who would be...
You've got Yemen, a lot of fears about contagion, Bahrain. Is that a region you'd like to be in?
Not at all, really. I mean, I know that, Orascom and a couple of the other big groups advertise on the channel, and they talk about how, it's the new millennia and one ought to be considering Egypt, but Egypt has been a very closed economy for the last couple of decades, and as a result it doesn't have very many interlinkages with the outside world. It's got 1 or 2 interesting companies that could be of interest, and we know that there's been this telecom deal going with Orascom Telecom, and MTN looked at it, and the Russians have looked at it. So I think there's probably some limited interest, but what I've heard from people who deal with business in Africa is that Egypt is an extremely difficult country in which to do business, because it's got this educated layer, it's elite layer that have been educated at Harvard or at Oxford. They know everything, and they know how to make money in that economy, and everyone else is totally clueless. So that could be attractive for outside investors, but not particularly so. And if you wanted regional exposure, there are other better places to get it. So I don't really think it's going to be very exciting when it opens. I wouldn't be surprised to see it kind of gap down slightly and then, stabilize, go sideways.
Let's turn our attention to Japan. Radiation, a lot of concerns.
So like over the weekend, it's all right. It's all fixed, huh?
It's not all fixed. I don't know what you've been reading or seeing, but they are finding radiation in milk, in food products.
But it's like completely levels that are totally safe, and it's no issue.
So if I bought you a glass of milk from Japan, you'd drink it right now. Or would you give it to your children? And I love the way...
milk. Well, I love
the way you say that things aren't that bad, but if you were in that situation, would you perhaps find it a bit more serious?
Well, a friend of mine who was on Twitter was saying that he was flying from some place to someone else on, like one of the Japanese airlines, and he looked at the bottle of sake that it was offered, and on the back it said made in Fukushima. I thought that's got to be a joke, but apparently not.
Well, there's alcohol in there.
They
perhaps
say,
it kills
in fact,
all the
the milk is clearly the biggest problem. But, I mean, just to back this thing up a bit, we live in Joburg on top of one of the world's largest uranium resources, because it's commingled with the gold, right?
Yes.
Levels of radiation here are quite high. The kind of radiation levels we're talking about are
Why are you
background.
bringing this up? This is something I'm passionate about.
Yeah.
And the truth of the matter is that the acid mine drainage, which is also filtering up to the top of the surface in Johannesburg, is actually being consumed by the animals, by the cattle, and
so
also
we
being
ought not to be eating those either.
Perhaps, yes.
But my point about all of this is, here's my prediction for what it's worth.
Yes.
In a couple of years' time, this will be seen as an example of how well nuclear power stations held up, and this will be held up as an example of why you ought to be building more nuclear power stations. Because some crappy old 40-year-old plant basically was hit by the worst earthquake you could possibly imagine, and the worst that happened was some minor leakage and a few downtime hours while they got the pumps reconnected.
And black smoke still spewing out of some of these reactors today. Paul, one of the reasons that US markets did relatively well yesterday, a flurry of mergers and acquisitions news. AT&T and the likes of the US T-Mobile in a deal that could be worth around $39 billion. US
Fantastic transaction, and interesting because if you know the background, I know we're short of time here, but AT&T used to be Marbell. That used to be the big national telephone company. They split it up 15 years ago. Basically, it's putting itself back together. So this is the merger of T-Mobile, which was owned by Deutsche Telekom, which was one of the mobile companies, number 4, plus AT&T, which is number 2. So that puts it in pole position. It's going to have about 130-odd million customers. Not as many as you'd think, because MTN has that many. The difference, of course, is that the average revenue per user for these guys is like $90 a month, which is a heck of a lot more than the average person joining the network in Nigeria, I can tell you. But interesting transaction. We think it's going to be great for mobile and people's use of the communication devices as their principal point of connection. And it makes for quite an interesting scenario investment-wise.
From a consumer perspective, what is interesting to note is that AT&T and T-Mobile are ranked the worst when it comes to service. Yes. So that will be interesting. But then Apple is also going to benefit. So
you put the worst and the worst together,
well,
and you'll
get... Who knows what you make. But what is also interesting is iPhone is also going to, and Apple is going to benefit. And I know you hold Apple as well.
So this is big for Apple because it means that AT&T, which is the one that had it first, gets to extend it to a bigger news of customers, and they're going to press ahead with LTE, which is 4G, the next generation, which is going to be even faster. It's saying that as a consequence of this deal, they'll roll that out more broadly, which is also good for Cisco and Juniper and all the guys that make network equipment. So, I'm very positive about that sector, as you know. And if they get together, that's great, because then they can monopolize the market and charge their customers even more.
Exciting stuff. You're always positive and bullish about everything. What is the one thing that you're not positive about? One thing.